have quite a few of these wrapping jigs out there now, and people are using them, and I'm getting good feedback from people. I did have a problem right at the beginning when I started making these, and I don't want to hide anything from anybody. I had about 3 of them, I believe, that got broken shipping. I did some drop tests at home. Where I made my mistake was I did the drop test on the thread carriage without the rods and the nuts and everything that holds the spools in place. Well, that adds quite a bit of weight to that. It's really hard to account for everything that can go wrong in shipping. Stuff gets broken shipping every day. While it seemed like everything was fine, it wasn't. I had a few of these that I had to replace. I got those out to them and everything's fine now, but I did redesign a part, so I'll just show you that real quickly. I extended a support piece out a little further on each end to give it support in areas where this could potentially happen. And it's hard to believe that 5 millimeters or so can make that much of a difference, but on a 3D print, it can make all the difference in the world. The parts are much stronger now. The way that I do these, I actually solvent weld the pieces together, and the solvent welding process basically makes it like one part. I mean, it melts the plastic and fuses it together. Instead of doing it with heat, though, it does it chemically. And I've definitely shipped a lot more with the modified part on them than I did on the first few that went out that didn't. And I've not had any issues since. So everybody's getting these now, and they're coming in without any damage or anything. But I did want people to know that I did make a mistake, and I didn't account for something that I should have foresaw, and that was my mistake. I'm a human being. I make mistakes. It's hard to account for everything. It's harder than I think a lot of people would realize. One other minor detail I'd like to mention is that I am constantly experimenting with different techniques to use with these 3D printers. Some of the parts, the surface finish on one side, that it's the side that is on the build plate, the part where the print starts. What I've been shipping out to this point has been shiny on that side, almost reflective, almost mirror-like, because it's actually printed on a mirror. I've been experimenting some with different textures on that side, and I'm really liking a matte finish that I get with a certain type of print bed. It gives it less shine, it has a matte finish, and it has a really nice texture to it that feels better in your hands. On my end, as far as the printing goes, I get more consistent results with it than I do printing on the mirrors. I'm going to probably transition into that. So if you get replacement parts or parts that you're wanting to add on and it has a matte finish, it does nothing as far as the functionality goes. It's just a little bit of a cosmetic difference. So moving on from that, I've got these new rod dryer setups that I think y'all are going to really like that work with my rod building jig. I'm going to have a few options for these dryers as far as what you can buy and what you might want. All of them that I sell with a motor as of this time, all of them are going to come with a 15 to 18 RPM motor. I can get things a lot cheaper if I buy them in bulk. I usually use around 10 RPMs. I've used these 15 to 18 RPM motors, and I've not had any issues using those either. It's just I kind of like the slower speed, and it's probably mental. But most people will always choose somewhere between 10 and 20 RPMs. Just from reading what I can and gathering what I can from other people, it seems like more people go towards the higher side or kind of lean towards the higher side. So that's what I chose in order to buy a bunch of these. Another thing about these little motors are they aren't meant to last forever. I mean, if you get a year or two out of them and replace them, that's pretty normal if you use them a lot. If you run them for hours on end, which these do, and you run them really regularly, you might get a year or two out of them. If you're more like me and you just build a few rods a year, they'll probably last you for 5 years. But what they are basically is the same type of motor that would be in a microwave turntable. They're not really meant to run continuously like we run them on these dryers, so they wear out faster. All these motors will reverse depending on where it's at in its position when it stops. Like if you unplug it or turn it off, it might start the opposite direction the next time it starts up. It just depends on where it's at in its phases on the gears, and it just picks the path of least resistance and turns that direction. So if you want to reverse direction on these, if you'll just grab, like I'm grabbing the chuck here, I'll grab the chuck and it'll reverse directions. When you feel it click one time, you let go and it's turning the opposite direction. It's as simple as that. You can't actually force it to turn one way or other by flipping a switch or anything like that. It just chooses the path of least resistance. Once it hits resistance, it tries to go the other way. These motors are really cheap to replace. If you ever do need to buy one, you can usually buy an individual one for about $10 or so. They're not a major expense, and I just consider it a wear item. They start getting noisy. Really, the shafts on them are already sloppy, but they'll get even worse, and they'll start making noise. And if you start hearing some noise from it that's a little louder than usual, because they're pretty quiet, if you start hearing some louder noises from it, just go ahead and order you one and keep it on hand, or keep one on hand anyway. You can just change it out whenever that time comes to change it out. People use them all the time for turning rods, and they use them for epoxy work on cups. That's a popular thing, a crafty thing people do now a lot. I'll also have an option to buy just the motor mount that snaps into place on the rails in the same way that the rod blank supports do. The bottom of them is made identical to each other. They snap into place just like the rod blank supports, and then you can choose whatever motor you want to put in one and just order the motor for it and wire it up so where you can plug it in, pick whatever kind of chuck you want, or you can order one of these chucks I'm going to show you, which are really, really nice. And then you'll have your own setup, and it's the cheapest way to do it as far as what you buy from me. But if you want to buy one with the chuck and extra rail stands, anything like that, I will have a package together where you can buy a couple rail stands, the motor and the mount for it, the adjustable chuck. I do all the wiring on the motors, that way you don't have to mess with it. The plugs I use, you can change the orientation of the plug to where it's either at 90 degrees or in line with the cord. There's nothing special about the plug-ins I use. In fact, they're one of the cheaper ones I can get a hold of in order to keep costs down. I don't want to charge an arm and a leg. I try to do things as inexpensively as I can on my end. That way you can buy stuff at a decent price and somewhat comparable to stuff that isn't custom made. And that's a hard thing to do, believe it or not. And a lot of that has to do just with my time. I have to account for that. I think I've got something that a lot of people are going to really like. I'll also have an option for you to buy the chuck by itself, and it should work on any of these synchronous style AC motors that have the 7mm shaft on them. These chucks are really nice, and I'll show you more about that in just a minute. But if you want to see all the different options available on this, you can go to my store, and there'll be a link in the description box below this video where I tell about the video, what's on the video and stuff. If you look down through there, you'll see the link to my store, and you can go there and check all these different options out and decide what might work best for you. You can also use these without even using my jig. Really, if you just get two stands with it, two of the rail stands, you can get your own EMT conduit and one of these motor mounts and put your own motor and own chuck or however you want to do it. But you can make a whole separate unit apart from your wrapping jig. Or even if you don't want to use one of my wrapping jigs, you can still use this rod dryer. You'll just need to get some 1/2-inch EMT conduit from your hardware store, which is really cheap, whatever length you want, up to 10 feet long, and you can use this setup for drying rods. You'll need some blank supports and the rod dryer setup and the rail stands, and it could serve as a independent dryer as well. Or you could set it up like I show here as a separate unit to use with my jigs, because it's all the same height and everything. You can make one to where you can wrap without the dryer in your way if you prefer to do that, and then just bring the dryer unit over and put it in line with your wrapping jig and do that also, and that will work just fine. Or you can mount it at the back side like I'm showing here. This is a 7-foot long wrapper. I'm going to put the dryer on one end and the rest of my setups on the other end, and it's all in one unit that way. And you can wrap, just don't connect it to the chuck so you can turn it freely, and then whenever you're done with your work on that end, tighten the chuck up on the rod grip or the blank or whatever that you need to chuck up in the chuck, and it will adjust a long ways, and I'll get more into that in just a minute. But you can do something really small in diameter on this without any trouble as well. So just real quickly, the way that I have these on my store, I have a listing for the mount by itself. It comes with 2 screws. These mounts are made to work with asynchronous AC motors that are in the 120 volt range. It'll work with most of those types of motors that have the 7mm shaft on them. So that's one option. You can buy just the motor mount. The next option would be to buy the motor and the mount together, and it's wired up with a plug on the end of it so you can plug it in to use it, and you would have to provide your own chuck with that setup. The next option would be the dryer motor, the mount, and the adjustable chuck, and I will go over that adjustable chuck here shortly, how it works and everything. And the last option I have here is for the dryer motor with the chuck and the mount and 2 extra rail stands. If you decide to go with that option, you'll need to provide your own 1/2 inch EMT conduit in a length somewhere around 6 inches or so for each piece. You'll need 3 pieces. Something with a little bit of length on it will give you some stability on this so it doesn't want to tip over one way or the other. That extra little bit of length will help. What I'm using in the video is a little shorter than that. It might be 3.5 inches or so. I wouldn't recommend going any shorter than that. I would try to stay somewhere around 5 to 6 inches on those pieces. It'll just give you a nice solid base for a dryer unit that's going to stand on its own without being tied into the jig. The last thing I want to talk about is this chuck, because it's very unusual. It's really based on a design that's similar. It's called a triangle chuck that I've seen online for years, and I've reached out to the person that came up with that design, and I haven't got any kind of response back. And I've reached out to the only person I've ever seen that was actually selling these in the United States. They never responded back. I can't see where they're available anywhere anymore. And I looked through patents, and the only things I saw were things that were expired and never granted a patent. So I don't know what happened in that process, but I can't get anybody to contact me back. I changed the design a little bit. It's not a triangle chuck, it's a square chuck, but it's the same basic idea. That it's a rubber band style chuck that is adjustable, and it self-centers to a certain degree. It's not as accurate as like a metal working lathe chuck would be or anything like that. It's what you need for a dryer because it's got the flexibility in the rubber bands. You don't need anything that's too perfect in alignment because no rod is perfect. You need some flexibility there, and this will prevent walkout. You see a lot of people using rod building lathes, and you see a lot of times where their blanks have walked out or they've came off the rollers and all sorts of issues. If you have a little flexibility in your system, it helps. It really does, because these things are not laser beam straight. These rod blanks, none of them are. And nothing's really concentric either, or what I would call concentric. To the eye, they look good, but if you got out micrometers and started checking things, you'd see there's a lot of variance in them. So they're not metal worker type precision things that we're doing here. This is stuff that's close, and to have a chuck that offers a little flexibility with the rubber bands is a good thing in my opinion. And these things work great. I mean, they lock stuff in and you don't really have to worry about it. I've even put these on and cut one of the rubber bands while it was running just to see what would happen in case a rubber band breaks or something, and they just keep turning, and they're not quite centered quite as well, but they keep working. So even if something like that happened, you're still going to get some holding power on that end, and it should go ahead and finish out its run without any issues. I ran one all day on a cut rubber band, so it only had 3 that were still engaged, and it kept turning just fine. I wasn't actually building a rod. I just had a blank in there and had it turning. But if I had epoxy on it, it would have completed its process and set up, and I wouldn't have ran into any issues, which is about as good of a chuck design, I think, as you can get, one that could get damaged and continue to work like that. I decided I would go ahead and start making my version of it. It's a little different. I mean, mine uses screw heads to help keep the rubber bands in place. The outer ring is loose fitting so that you can turn it, and also so you can slide it up and down, because you need to slide it up and down in order to move over the screws with the rubber band so that it can wrap around the object that you're holding. And once it is wrapped around it, its natural tendency is to want to unwrap. Well, the screws and the screw heads keep it from unwrapping. The screw head keeps it from moving up so it can unwrap. and the screws themselves act as a stopper so it can't turn further backwards. And you don't have to move it very far to lock something in place. You usually make a quarter turn. You might need to make a little further turn, like a half turn, if you got something really small, which would basically wrap the rubber bands around the object 2 times, and that will help hold it tighter. But you really shouldn't have to get more than 2 wraps of the rubber bands around any object. On something like a grip or something, you just make that initial quarter turn and it'll lock into place and hold just fine because the diameter is so much larger. But as you can see here, I've got a bamboo skewer, which is really small. I don't know, it's probably 1/8 of an inch or so, and it holds it just fine and turns it just fine. To me, this is one of the nicer ideas I've ever come across for a dryer chuck of any sort, and it's almost criminal that it's not available. It's such a simple idea and it works so well. It needs to be out there regardless if you were granted a patent or not. You know, somebody needs to be producing something similar. So I'm just doing it, and if they make me stop doing it at some point, somebody does, then I will. But for now, I'm just going to make these available because it's too good of an idea not to use. And I thought about using a simple rubber band chuck, but they just don't work that well. They're okay for most things. If you're using a grip on a rod to hold in a rubber band chuck, a traditional style one, they hold just fine. If you have to do anything smaller, then they're not as good, or you have to work around it by wrapping the rubber bands around and things like that. But with this, a quick turn of the ring and you can lock whatever you're trying to hold in place really fast and really simply, and it self-centers to a certain degree also. It's just a good setup. Like I said, I checked for patents and I cannot find anything to where it's patented even on the triangle shaped one. Now this is different, so I'm not even sure if I'd run into an issue just because it works in a similar manner. It's made quite a bit different than the other one, so I'm not even sure that I would run into an issue, but I just wanted to throw it out there in case somebody saw it and thought, hey, that guy stole somebody else's idea. I borrowed somebody else's idea, but I didn't make it exactly the same, I guess is what I'm getting at. And I really don't think it's a problem, but if y'all got any comments on that, you can leave them below. I just really think it's a shame that you can't get these in the original design. And to me, my design's actually a little better. I actually have made one myself that was in the triangle configuration. If you cut a band on that one, it severely off centers the rod. So to me, the square design is actually a little bit better implementation of the general idea. I really appreciate y'all watching, and go check out my store at Shopify. There's links in the description if you want to see about purchasing any of these items. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments below, or you can always email me, thefishinghobby@gmail.com. I'll talk to y'all later.